Hey YouTube, I'm Ross Stewart with Stewart Media Digital, and today I'm going to be talking about the Sony 24mm f2.8 G lens for the Sony mirrorless system. Now, I recorded an entire other video where I kind of talked about this lens being almost pointless because it's sort of similar to our phone's standard lens and the aperture is not that great. But then I took it on a trip through New England and used it as a travel lens, and that completely changed my mind. So I scrapped that other video and decided to make a brand new video talking about how, in my opinion, this little Sony G lens might be the ultimate travel lens for the Sony mirrorless system. First off, I have to say 24mm is not necessarily the most versatile. It might not be as handy as a zoom lens, but 24mm is a great focal length for a lot of travel photography situations. So first, let's talk real quick about why 24mm is a great focal length for travel photography. It is on the wider end of the more or less standard range. So you can get a lot of great cityscapes, a lot of cool street photography, a lot of cool nature photos. I even got really close and took some really interesting wildlife photos with this lens, believe it or not. And I actually really loved using it while traveling. I'm used to breaking my back carrying around really large lenses, zoom lenses. I typically travel with my 16 to 35 G Master lens, and that's not the heaviest lens out there, but when you're carrying that around for hours and hours and hours, you do start to feel it. So let's get into this lens. Let's talk about everything from build quality, image quality, autofocus, and all the other little details to help you decide if this is the right lens for you. Now, real quick, I don't own this lens. I rented it through aperturent.com. If you are interested in renting gear that you don't own, be sure to check them out. I use them every single time I want to review or use a piece of glass or other hardware that I don't own, and I always have a great experience. So be sure to check them out in the link below. First up, let's talk about build quality. In terms of body design, Sony released 3 lenses with identical body design, more or less. This 24mm 2.8, this 50mm 2.5, and also a 40mm 2.5, which I don't currently have my hands on. I don't totally see the point in releasing a 40 and a 50 that are almost identical. If you prefer 40 or over 50, please let me know in the comments section below. I'm really interested to hear what people have to say about that. In general, in terms of build quality though, this lens and the other two with the same body look and feel really good. They're really sturdy, they're really light, and they've got a bunch of really cool features. The weight of this lens comes just about to 0.35 pounds or 161 grams. So it is nice and light. It balances really nicely on any of Sony's mirrorless bodies, even Sony's smaller APS-C bodies, which is the first time I've ever gotten to say that in a lens review, so that is really cool. Moving on to the rings. The rings, along with all the other features on this lens, are really small and compact. So if you've got really big hands, you may have trouble working your way around this lens. But the focus ring is pretty nice. It's got a good amount of resistance. It is focused by wire, but in some situations where I have chosen to manually focus, I've had no trouble locking really precise focus with this focus ring. It also has an autofocus, manual focus switch, so it's really easy to switch it over to manual focus anytime you want to do that. Next up, it has a manual aperture ring, which in every video when a lens has the manual aperture ring, I always mention how kind of controversial it is, but I personally really like seeing that Sony is including this in more and more of their lenses. The manual aperture ring starts at f2.8 and goes all the way to f22 in thirds of stops with a click for auto, which allows you to control the aperture on the back of your camera. Now, in addition to the manual aperture ring, it has a switch to declick the aperture, which will prevent it from stopping at those perfect thirds, so that you can transition aperture much more smoothly, which I understand can be useful for video shooters, but I think that's gonna be in very specific situations that won't apply to most people. Next up, it has one focus lock button here on the side. These are customizable to do pretty much anything you want them to do. By default, if you hold it down though, it just prevents the camera from changing its focal point. And finally, on build quality, it is partially weather sealed. Sony's website says it is moisture and dust resistant. It does have a nice little rubber gasket here on the back, but the front element is lacking that fluorine coating. So if you do want it to be more weather sealed, you will require one of those screw-on filters. And real quick on the topic of filters, it does have a 49mm filter thread, which is pretty common among Sony's smaller lenses. So you should be able to get some nice affordable filters if you like to use those. And it does come with this nice little lens hood, which does come in handy for a lot of the ways in which I would choose to use this lens, meaning a lot of outdoor landscape and cityscapes where you might get some bright sun trying to peek in from the sides. So I am really glad Sony included this. Now let's talk about image quality. This lens has 8 elements in 7 groups, including 3 aspherical elements for some pretty impressive sharpness. This is by no means the sharpest lens I've ever tested, but for what you're getting and what you're paying, it is still pretty impressive. Wide open at 2.8, it is very sharp in the middle. The corners do get a little soft, but as you start to stop down, the corners sharpen right up. In terms of flaring and ghosting, this lens handles really well. I got some sunrise photos up in New England and I shot directly into that bright morning sun and it handled it really beautifully. In some situations, it may not always be ideal or the best, but for a lot of what I used it for, I was really impressed. Now let's talk about bokeh. Bokeh on a 2.8 aperture lens, 24mm, is not going to be the easiest thing to get, but when you do get it, it is surprisingly pleasing. In the middle, it is nice and round, wide open. As you start to stop down though, it is a 7-bladed aperture and the blades do not look rounded. So as you stop down, you do get those hard edges on the bokeh, which honestly sometimes I think can look cool. Some people think of it as a downside. I'm not one of those people. Towards the edges, you do get some cat eye bokeh, but again, it's really not that bad. The cat eye is much less than a lot of other lenses I've tested, and that's probably because of how short the lens is. There's this whole scientific explanation about what causes cat eye bokeh that I won't get into, but this lens has really nice bokeh when you are capable of achieving it with that wide angle f2.8 aperture. So don't expect too much in terms of bokeh, but when you do get it, it's really nice. Now, unfortunately, I do have a couple of bad things to say about the image quality. For one, the vignetting is pretty bad. It's really bad at 2.8, but it continues to be pretty noticeable even as you go down a couple of stops. A lot of people are going to say that this really isn't a big deal. Vignetting is easily corrected in Photoshop or Lightroom, and that's definitely true. But in some situations, especially when you're already cranking the ISO of your camera, having to digitally up the brightness of the corners may push your images, the corners of your images, into that ugly, grainy zone. So if you're looking for really clean images, corner to corner, in any kind of low light situation, that vignetting is going to cause some problems. But again, that's a specific situation that may not apply to you, the types of photography you do, but definitely keep it in mind. Additionally, it does have some pretty noticeable barrel distortion, which again, super easily fixed, but definitely something to be aware of. Next, let's talk about autofocus. It is fast and accurate. It is not the best autofocusing lens in terms of just snappiness, responsiveness that I've ever used, but it is still really impressive, and I doubt many people are going to have issues with it. It just works. There's not a whole lot to say about it. If you are shooting video with any of the newer model cameras that do the eye tracking, it does that really well. And for still photography, it snaps from subject to subject really nicely. The minimum focusing distance is pretty good for a wide angle lens. It is 7 inches or about 178 centimeters. Now, something to be aware of in terms of the focus, especially if you're a video shooter, is it does exhibit some focus breathing, which is where the field of view changes slightly as you focus from far away to close up and vice versa. Not the biggest deal for a lot of people, but if that is something that you care about, definitely something to be aware of. Next up, just for fun, let's compare it to what I think are its biggest competitors. First up is I actually own this lens and I have a review entirely about it. This is the 28mm f2 that Sony put out a couple years ago. I wasn't the kindest to this lens in my review, and not surprisingly, it is my most disliked review. People hate hearing that gear they already own might have problems. This lens is a 28mm, so the field of view is a little bit tighter, but it is also an f2 aperture, so you do get a little bit better low light performance and the ability to capture a little bit more bokeh. It is also $150 cheaper at $450 US. Now, the reason that video got so many dislikes is because I did talk about how bad the vignetting and barrel distortion are. I do think it's a little bit worse on this lens than on the 24 we've been talking about, but both lenses do exhibit that vignetting and barrel distortion. I personally still really like this 28mm, and I will probably hang on to this one instead of upgrading to the Sony G24mm. And next up, just for fun, let's compare it to the G Master 24mm f1.4. Now, that lens is a G Master lens versus this one being a G lens, so it is in a completely different class. It is also $1,400 US. That $800 price difference may alone be a deal breaker to a lot of people. Now, I don't personally own the G Master version, but I have gotten to use it and I do absolutely love that lens. It is a professional grade lens for people who just need the absolute best sharpness, bokeh, low light performance, subject separation, autofocus. It is quite a bit larger than this smaller G lens, but for a G Master lens, it's honestly not that big. It is still fairly portable. But yeah, like I said, totally different class, totally different purpose. If you are looking for a travel lens, I still recommend this one over the G Master lens. Now, just some closing thoughts. Again, my initial reaction was, what is the point of a 24mm f2.8? Because it is so similar to a lot of what you'd get from a smartphone. But if you really just want that extra little bit to get some really nice photos with your Sony mirrorless camera when you're on vacation specifically, this lens is really, really ideal for that. Now, if you own this lens or if you're interested in this lens for something other than vacation photography or travel photography of any kind, please let me know what else you think it's good for, because I'm really interested in Sony making these smaller, more portable, lighter weight lenses. I'd really like to know what everybody uses them for, so please be sure to drop that in the comments below. And finally, a special thanks to aperturant.com. I rent all my lenses through them. If you have a lens in mind that you would like me to review, please mention that in the comments also, and I will do my best to get my hands on it. And as always, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much.